Hello and welcome to Cloud 9 Fin. This is Jane's LME Addiction, a podcast where we talk about liability management. With me today is Scott Greenberg, Global Head of Gibson Dunn's Restructuring Group and a member of the Executive Committee. Thanks for joining me today, Scott.
Thank you for having me.
Before we dive into the month's topic, I'd love to hear just a little bit about how Gibson sort of became the go-to firm for term lenders looking for liability management solutions.
Well, I appreciate that. I think we're one of several that kind of spend a lot of time in this space. Look, I would say our practice, not to go too far down memory lane, but I think it really started at my previous firm when we were at Jones Day, representing ad hoc lender groups. It's not always term lenders who represent bondholders, et cetera, but I do think it's fair to say that we tend to focus on kind of the senior part of the capital stack. And I think candidly, maybe some of our success over the years has been our loyalty to those same players in the stack, meaning, that's where we focus. We do a lot of repeat work with a lot of the same players, asset managers, et cetera. And I think in the scenarios where we don't get an assignment and a competitor gets an assignment, we don't tend to troll up and down the capital stack, so to speak. And I think it's just, at least mine and I think my team's long-term view of, if people are giving you work and you're doing great work for people and they're loyal to you, if you miss out on a particular assignment, it's probably not in your long-term interest to then go after them in that deal. So I think we've just built a lot of loyalty over the last, 10 to 12 or 13 years at this point of really spending a lot of time with ad hoc groups. And I think that predates LME, to be clear. Obviously, LME has become the flavor, which is why we're here today.
Yes. And speaking of that, it seems like a lot of your clients are often CLO managers who, in the past, before this sort of LME world came about, and before, I know we can't talk about CERTA since your firm is actively involved, but it seemed like that was sort of like the turning point where CLOs went from sort of prey to predator. And you can tell me if that is a proper assessment.
Wouldn't call our clients predators. That probably wouldn't be too well received.
That is fair.
I would say historically, I think it actually goes back well before CERTA, to be clear, but I would say historically, there was this pre-submission in the marketplace that somehow, CLOs and asset managers couldn't do X, couldn't do Y, couldn't take equity, which is not right, couldn't provide a DIP financing, back in the days of just regular way restructurings, which was not right. And I think what really changed was, probably 12 to 15 years ago, there was a lot of turnover in paper when something got distressed and became a restructuring, meaning CLOs would sell down or sell out of their positions and the traditional hedge funds would buy in and kind of take over and drive a process. That changed. And I think that's been the biggest change in the marketplace, which is the par guys aren't necessarily selling out. And again, our groups are often very mixed, right? You'll have a lot of par people, but then there'll be turnover in the paper and you'll get a mixture of par people and secondary folks in the ad hoc groups. But I think, I think of, and I was involved in this case when I was at my prior firm, but I think of like J. Crew, the first J. Crew, not the bankruptcy, with the drop down of the IP. And, it was a very reactionary response, meaning the lenders all got together, the IP was already dropped, you had to run to state court to try to litigate, to kind of put the genie back in the bottle. And state court processes as opposed to bankruptcy court are very slow. They're very expensive. They're not quite as predictable. And it's kind of a tough place to be. And that to me felt more like defensive organization, and sometimes too late organization. I think what changed post J. Crew, certainly from my own perspective, was I think lenders understood the benefits of organizing early and being more front-footed to defend themselves as a unified front than reactionary. So I don't know that I do think people got sick of being prey. I agree with you there. I don't know that our clients became predators. I think they just are sophisticated.
Took control of their own destiny is a better way of putting it.
That I think is a fair assessment, right? Which is we're big lenders. We have a lot of exposure. We have LPs. We have fiduciary obligations, and we're going to use the same tools in the tool chest that everyone else is using. I think is a better way to think about it.
And I guess also thinking about like J. Crew versus CERTA. CERTA seemed like sort of the response to J. Crew, which is don't drop the collateral down. Let's all work together and come up with sort of some sort of solution where we're working together.
Yeah, I would say just given let me stick to what's public, because there's obviously still overhang of litigation. And all this came out in the CERTA trial in Houston, which is the risk that the lenders were facing at the time was J.Crew, right? Was a group of lenders that were going to drop the IP of CERTA and do the deal away. And I think a lot of people that had experienced J.Crew just felt it was a painful and long process, to my point about state court litigation, and thought to themselves, there needs to be a better way. So,
yeah, makes sense. Moving away from things you can't talk about to things you can.
Perfect.
Let's talk about cooperation agreements.
Sure.
It seems like they're just present in every situation that I've been looking at recently. And that has only started, at least I know that they've been around for many years, but it seems like they've become popularized in the last few.
I think that's fair. And I think some of them go back a while. I think iHeart, which was some of my former partners were involved in that one. I think literally what's really happened, and 100% they've gone up exponentially. I'm sure you guys probably have better data than I do in terms of what the percentage is. But I think what's happened is, as LME has become more popular, more acceptable, more sponsors are taking part in it. Obviously, more advisors are pushing it, right, on their clients and selling the product. Lenders with very loose documents, which is just reality of the marketplace, have had to come up with more creative ways to defend themselves against aggressive LME transactions. And I think that's really where the cooperation agreements came into being, right? Not to suggest that we're not going to do a deal with the company, whether it's they need liquidity or they need maturity extension or they need deleveraging. That's all fair, but we're not going to be picked apart, and kind of cherry picked and lowest common denominator approach, where lenders end up with a bad deal because there's no alternative. And I think that's really the genesis and where cooperation agreements started, which is, hey, we're going to get together as lenders, to my point about being proactive as opposed to reactive, and we're going to negotiate from a position of strength as opposed to from a position of weakness.
Why do you think that companies and sponsors loathe co-op agreements in a way that they don't seem to ad hoc groups?
Yeah, I mean, it's just negotiating leverage, right? And so if you're the sponsor and the company and the company's advisors, and let's just assume take a normal term loan B document with a lot of room, a lot of basket capacity, ability to designate unrestricted subsidiaries, all this hardware, so to speak, that candidly, smart lawyers on both sides of the table have figured out ways to really exploit to the benefit of the sponsor. The cooperation agreement, and we could dig into it. I mean, it doesn't take, at least in my view as a lender's lawyer, it doesn't take all the sponsor's optionality off the table. It certainly doesn't. It limits the range of optionality. And I assume if you're the sponsor, you want all the tools in the tool chest, not just a couple wrenches. And so I think that's the reaction. At least in my experience, you still get to a deal. It's just probably a better deal for the lenders than the sponsor would otherwise probably do.
Can you offer up just some of the limitations? Because I know, companies and sponsors, they've been dying to get their hands on these co-ops. A lot of them apparently have never even seen the actual language of the co-op. Can you give some sort of overview of what's involved? What does it restrict?
Well, I mean, think of it this way, right?
And are they different? Are there different flavors of co-ops?
Yes. That we should definitely get into, because it's like anything else. Something starts as X and, transforms into Y and Z. So I'll take an example of what co-ops do not prevent, right? When you're having this conversation with clients, right? If you have RP and PI capacity where you could drop assets and you can move things into an unrestricted subsidiary, and a bunch of lenders then go and co-op up and just make it up. Your debt's trading at 70 cents. So there's potential discount capture. A cooperation agreement does not prevent the sponsor from using the credit agreement to drop that asset to the unsub. If that ability exists in the credit agreement, it exists. Now, there may be other type of claims, fraudulent transfer, whatever, depending on the solvency of the entity. But what it does prevent, or at least what it should prevent or dissuade, is the sponsor believing, hey, I'm going to drop this asset. My paper that trades at 70 is going to move to 60 on the news, and then I'm going to go tender at 65, and I'm going to pick people off. Because if you have 95% of the loan locked into a cooperation agreement, everyone could say, no, we're not doing that deal. So it's not that the cooperation agreement prevents all kinds of bad behavior. It's meant to dissuade certain types of bad behavior. Now, if you have a cooperation agreement and you have a maturity that needs to be solved for, then I think it is a little more forceful, right? Because if everyone's locking arms and saying, we won't do this deal, but we'll do that deal, and we have 95% of the loan, like if you're the company or the sponsor, there's no point in even trying if only 5% are outside of the deal. So to me, they're not a fix-all. And I, as much as I'm sure the market perception is, Gibson or one of our competitors, they're out pushing the co-op. Like, it's not necessarily true because it's not a one-size-fits-all. And to your point about co-ops have changed, they really have changed, particularly when you've gotten into this three-dimensional chess with LME, where sometimes they may actually cut against some of the bigger guys, best incentives to get a better deal done for themselves.
Makes sense. And so what do you say to sponsors and companies or bondholders who are left out or lenders who are left out who say, this is an antitrust problem? We're trying to go out into our market and our market is now limited.
Well, again, we've jumped a couple steps ahead. Because we should probably go back at some point and discuss the various types of cooperation agreements.
So let's take a step back and let's talk about that first. Exactly.
I don't think everything's on
So what are the different flavors of co-ops?
So in my mind, there's three, and there's definitely many permutations of this. But at a high level, I think there's the traditional co-op, come one, come all. Everyone locks arms. Everyone gets the same deal, and we all negotiate with the company/sponsor from a position of strength.
And that doesn't mean that everyone in the entire class is necessarily in the co-op. It just means that everyone is invited to the co-op.
It's open to everyone.
Okay.
Right. And candidly, from a lender perspective, in some ways, those are the best in the sense that the liquidity of the paper is best. Because if you have 95, 96, 97% take up on the co-op, the paper is very liquid in the secondary market. If you have a 50% co-op, it's very different. So I would say the original kind of come one, come all co-op, open to everyone gets the same deal. There's the other end of that spectrum, and I'm sure you guys have reported on a bunch of these, which is the 51% co-op or the 50.1% co-op. And the thesis behind those typically is it's early. The biggest lenders get together, paper's trading at a discount. There's a high chance that this could turn into some liability management transaction. And they're preserving the optionality to do a better deal for the biggest guys. And usually what those transform into is, I won't name any specific transactions, but you guys know them all. It turns into some kind of tiered transaction where everyone participates. The 50.1 get the best deal. The 49 get to participate, but it's on different terms.
It does seem like that's become sort of the popular one of the day.
Well, I would say that's the flavor of LME. I don't know that that's the flavor of co-ops. I would say the 50.1% co-op is still an outlier. And from a liquidity perspective, probably the worst, to be honest. And, we're involved in some of these. When it gets out to the market, there's a 51% co-op. You start seeing massive trading disparity between the co-op and the non-co-op paper. So I actually don't, yes, you're preserving optionality, but the kind of the impact on liquidity is not amazing. And that's where I think the third flavor of the co-op in my mind is becoming the most popular, and certainly on deals we're involved in, which is the co-op with a carve out, right? So everyone's entitled to play. It's open to everyone. There's an understanding that the biggest folks that are going to likely restrict and therefore impact their liquidity and are going to do all the heavy lifting are going to be entitled to something that's a little bit better than the other folks. And obviously the flavor of how much better becomes the issue that you need to navigate. But I think that in my mind is probably the most popular form of co-op.
And are you seeing the difference come out either in what they're actually getting, like versus par, or are you seeing it more in fees, or both?
You could, this is where it gets a little bit gray. So the idea is that there's the carve out premium. What does that mean? Right. And there's not really great guardrails around it, although there's it's becoming precedent. So people have a feel for like what's market, what's not market. You could take that in fees, just like you would have in the old days, a backstop fee on a dip, where the biggest guys take a little bit extra juice for doing the work and backstopping the economics. So it could be dollars. It could be exchange rate, right? You could take your fees I exchange at 95, you exchange at 90. So there's different currencies you could use to compensate the bigger folks for that incremental work. And look, again, it's some deals have really pushed the limits, obviously. And when you step back from it at the end of the day, and we all play in the same sandbox again and again and again. So like people have to be smart and have a long view when they do these deals. You can push the envelope, but you can only push it so far, right? And the idea is in these transactions, both from the sponsor and the large lender's perspective, you want to get participation as high as possible. And so if there's some spread, I think the smaller lenders get that, right? The bigger guys rolled up their sleeves, they did the work, they carried the transaction. But if that spread starts to get too big, that's where you start to invite litigation, minority groups, all the stuff that we would love to avoid.
And I mean, to date, at least I'm not familiar, there hasn't really been any co-op litigation amongst co-op holders.
None that I'm aware of. We've certainly behind the scenes had some co-op drama, which we've been able to kind of keep in the family and work through. But no, I haven't seen, at least in any of my deals, I'm not aware of it in anyone else's deals where like someone says, breach a contract, you violated the co-op, I'm coming after you. I haven't seen that.
Yeah. And so now moving forward again to my antitrust question.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, look, I'm just a simple bankruptcy lawyer, so I don't mean to pretend to be an antitrust or a regulatory expert. But the good news is I work at a very large law firm and I have all of those expertise in-house. And I would say we have stress tested, as I'm sure my competitors have, right? Co-ops with our antitrust folks, both in the US and in Europe, because obviously co-ops have made their way across the pond. And I think everyone feels really good about it, meaning we think they withstand challenge. I would say, like, simple analogy coming from the bankruptcy lawyer, not the antitrust expert, is like, if everyone got together, in the syndicated market, all the big guys and said, anytime XYZ sponsor comes to market, we're not doing a deal for less than S plus 800, 800 pips. Then I think, my antitrust people would say, you got a problem, right? Because you're shutting down the marketplace for these people. That's very different from the loan's already been syndicated. It's now stressy or distressed. There's a problem where they need to come back to ask for relief from their original terms of their loan, and lenders lock together and say, we're willing to have that negotiation, but we're going to do it as a group. That, again, this is the simplistic bankruptcy lawyer's view, but that is not an antitrust problem. And then Europe's a little bit different because you have MAR and other regulatory regimes you need to navigate. But I think the answer coming out of Europe has been, and we should obviously stress test these with our antitrust lawyers before you go out with these, you're good. And look, I know there are plenty of people out there talking their book in terms of violate this, that, and the other. I get it. They have clients too. But I think myself and probably all the other folks that, we compete for business with that also have lots of co-ops in the market all feel pretty good about it.
Yeah. I mean, as you know, I too am not an antitrust lawyer, never was. But I guess what makes this an interesting intellectual exercise is really just that there's case law that says, okay, if it's a loan that's already been issued and you're just trying to get your money back, that is absolutely not an antitrust concern. Yeah. And then there's other case law that says in a completely different context, okay, if people are making horizontal agreements and all of these people are on the same page or making agreements about new loans, then maybe there's an issue. Yeah. And so that's sort of like great when it comes to LME is where you're both trying to get your money back and at the same time and I think people who are on the lender side will say this is all part of the same exact thing, which is that it's at the very least it's an ancillary agreement.
Yeah. Although on the new money piece of it, right, to that point, like, we're not the only source of capital, right? We're existing, like, private credit market is huge.
Yeah.
And the reality is, if you look at the playbook for most sponsors, let's assume you have like a 26 maturity and myself or, one of our peers goes out and co-ops up a group because the loan trades at 75. They'll go to the capital markets. Let's assume they fail. They'll go to the private credit markets. They'll go to certain lenders, that have massive private credit arms and find. We're like the last resort. So it's not as if we're door number one. I mean, they never come to us first. It's a rare occasion where the sponsor says, got to go back to my lenders. They play every other field and every other door, and then they come to us as last resort. And I think at that point in time, again, if lenders all said, I'm just not going to talk to you, I'll see you in bankruptcy court, then I think you got a problem. Again, I'm not the antitrust expert, but that's never, ever, ever been the tone of our clients, right? It's just, okay, like let's negotiate, but like let's negotiate for a deal that's not just a win for you, it's a win for everyone.
Yeah.
So
Makes sense.
It's leveling the playing field against, documents which are not amazing, and smart lawyers have been driving trucks through over the last 10 years. So,
so you mentioned Europe, and as the global chair, curious, you've been bringing co-ops to Europe, I imagine, because the same shenanigans have been going on over there in the LME world. How's that process been?
Yeah. A lot of battle wounds on that one over the last year. I would say, yes, co-ops are making their way to Europe. And again, it's just like it happened here. It's following the LME, right? As the LME makes its way to Europe, lenders are trying to figure out how to be smarter and more front-footed to combat and to keep the playing field as level as possible. And so you have seen cooperation agreements make their way across the pond. I would say, obviously we're involved in Altice France right now at SFR, where we have a $20+ billion cooperation agreement across the term loan and the SSNs. There's a separate group that has the unsecureds that they also have a co-op agreement. I think, candidly, Altice is a great example. I think it's worked really well, without getting ahead of the news because it leaks on our deal. But like, we've been in negotiations with the company for a really long time. And I'm sure in the absence of that cooperation agreement, just given how big our group is, at times with frustration on both sides of the table, the idea that the company would have peeled off and tried to cut a bilateral deal with a large lender and, kind of stuck it to everyone else, I think they 100% would have, but for the existence of the co-op. So what I would say, generally speaking, is it's fairly new technology there. It's almost a trip down memory lane for me because 8 or 9 years ago, when I tried to put a co-op in place on a deal in the US, I'd have to spend a lot of time with people's internal legal, compliance, et cetera. And the focus, it seems not the only focus, but the focus is really liquidity. Like, how's this thing going to impact the liquidity of paper? The markets here, the trading desks here, they all know how to deal with co-op paper. In Europe, obviously, new technology. So it's that learning curve again for the trading desks to make sure liquidity is not hampered for the lenders. And what I would say is it's still nowhere near, obviously, as prevalent as in the US, but it's coming, right, as LME comes. And I'm involved in at least 4 or 5 right now that are cross-border European deals with my partners overseas, where we have cooperation agreements in place. And I would say they take more time to get done. They take a little more handholding because, again, people just aren't used to them yet. But the progression reminds me of what happened here, 5 to 7 years ago. So my guess is, unless LME goes away in Europe, which I don't think it's going to, similar sponsors, same documents, smaller pond where people are a lot more sensitive to doing that kind of stuff. So I do think there's a cultural element that maybe doesn't exist here anymore. Then I think the cooperation agreements will continue to grow in Europe.
Makes sense. So my final question for you is, where do you see this year's LME space going? Any interesting new innovations that you see coming or that you've put into practice? What's the market?
Yeah, here's what I would say it's not. And again, I'm not going to get into the substance of CERTA given our involvement, but like when CERTA came out at the end of the year, there were a lot of articles and theories of like LME's dead. And I kind of shook my head and said, this is all very creative bankers and lawyers. Everyone's super smart, right? You just build a different mousetrap. It
would have been nice though if everyone just shook hands and said, "Okay, everyone's going to get paid back."
Well, we could have went back to being traditional restructuring lawyers.
Yeah,
It would probably make our life easier with less people pissed off at you. But in all seriousness, I think the reality is LME is still very hot and heavy. I think we're involved in a bunch of transactions going on now. There have been a bunch, obviously, that have gone to market since the beginning of the year, post CERTA. Structures just change a bit. It all depends on the document. So it's hard to say, like, every deal is different depending on what room you do and do not have in the documents. I think we're the market, and I think that the market was trending this way long before the Fifth Circuit decision. But I think where the market's been trending for the last year and a half, and you continue to see it, is deals are not truly non-pro rata in the sense that some people get to participate, but some people don't. Deals are opened up to everyone. It's just a mixture of exchange rates and currency, as I said earlier, to try to get the highest amount of participation. So I think you're going to continue to see deals trend in the everyone's invited to play. There will be some spread. Does that spread narrow a little bit because minority lenders feel emboldened by whatever CERTA or another decision and are more prone to litigate? Maybe. I think that's where you could see some change. But I don't think the market's going away anytime soon. And in fairness, I mean, candidly, from a lender lawyer perspective, when you can see the writing on the wall that the company is, heading in a certain direction, it would be much easier for us and our clients just rip off the Band-Aid and deal with it. But the reality is, if you're a sponsor with LPs, just playing devil's advocate, and they have fiduciary obligations as well, they're going to continue to flip the card until they're out of cards. And so I think what our restructuring world has really become is everything starts with the LME piece, because in a vast majority of cases, that's going to be play number one. And then if that doesn't succeed in a year or 2 years or 3 years, whatever the time horizon is, or envision 6 months, then we're all back at the table and it's a restructuring. So I think the biggest change I've seen in my 23 years, however long I've been doing this, is these are now two-step dances, whereas there are very few cases anymore that just go straight to the restructuring. So I think that's the biggest change.
Can't imagine that there will be yet another Texas two-step name. I feel like so many things have used that title in the restructuring space specifically. Yeah. But two steps, that makes sense. But 2 steps and participation trophies are the takeaways.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it's going to be a more inclusive environment. That doesn't mean everyone's getting the same deal, but everyone's going to be invited to play. And I think so long as, again, it's art, not science, right? So long as you find that sweet spot in the middle in these deals where people feel like they're doing good enough, even if they're not in that top, largest lender group, then these will turn out well. And again, no litigation, no tough decisions, and the market will go forward. It's a question, right? Sometimes people push the envelope pretty far, and that's what invites the litigation.
Well, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Of course.
Can't get enough of co-ops. Always happy to talk about it.
And thank you to our listeners. If you have any questions or comments, please reach out to podcast@9fin.com.